Hello and good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Rita Henderson. For those of you who are new, welcome to the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a space to serve as a movement incubator, a space for political education, as well as
Thank you all for joining us today.
Second. I'm getting a double.
Henderson. For those of you
Oh, there you are. I'm sorry. This People's Forum is a space to serve as a movement incubator, a space for political education, as well as people's culture. Although our physical space is currently closed, we are happy to be continuing our programming online. Just a reminder for those of you who are on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A function. And for those of you who are tuning in on YouTube, you can post your questions on our live chat. And also, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. In honor of International Human Rights Day, we believe it's important to understand the struggle for human rights and Black liberation in the interim of a transition from Trump to the Biden administration. Malcolm X spoke before the Organization of African Unity, calling the United States to be indicted for its racist and systematic repression of Black people. Over 50 years later, Malcolm's message rings true as white supremacy and capitalism continue their violent hold over Black lives. I'm happy to introduce our moderator today, who is the director of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, Najha Zigbi-Johnson. Welcome, Najha.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to open with a moment of silence for Brandon Bernard, who will have been wrongfully and immorally executed by this time today. Mr. Bernard is the 9th person to be executed under Attorney General Bill Barr since this summer. His state-sanctioned lynching is why human rights matter. Let us lift up his name, his loved ones, and send out peace and positivity as he makes his premature ascent into the afterlife. Thank you. Today is International Human Rights Day, and across the world, we celebrate and struggle and love as we speak out against empire, white supremacy, patriarchy, inequity, and the vapid greed fueled by unchecked capitalism. It is my hope that today's conversation will be a meditation on this reality and also a call to action, with clarified sense of how and what we must do to build power, longevity, and relationships grounded in our collective flourishing and freedom. The moment we are living in requires a sort of political clarity and precision that comes from the ground up, exemplified and molded by grassroots leaders who heed the global charge for human rights and sustainability. In particular, I want to lift up our beloved ancestor, Malcolm X, whose work as a global leader and voice for Black people across the diaspora continues to guide our movement work, scholarship, and religio-spiritual journeys. In the last year of his short yet impactful life, Malcolm X spent 5 months abroad in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, building alongside anti-colonial leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere. It was after making Hajj that Malcolm grew in his political analysis to one of transnationalism, where he understood that the reach of white supremacy and empire is decidedly global, and thus our struggle for freedom, sovereignty, and power must also be global. While visiting Cairo, Egypt in July of 1964, Malcolm delivered a memorandum to the Organization of African Unity. In this memorandum, Malcolm spoke at once about his acute understanding of transnationalism and also about his belief that the collective understanding around the civil rights movement in the United States had to evolve into a struggle for global human rights. Malcolm implored his comrades abroad to not only endorse this conceptual reframing of the Black struggle, but to also charge the US human rights abuses of its Black citizenry before the United Nations as a damning condemnation of supposed democracy and world leadership. This charge represents some of Malcolm's most impactful work as a freedom fighter and leader of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which he founded at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem in 1964, and modeled off the Organization of African Unity. I believe Malcolm's work with the OAAU continues to offer us gems of wisdom as we struggle through this pandemic, the horrors of our treacherous president, and as we prepare to move into a post-Trump era. as we work in partnership with the People's Forum, the Greater Washington Heights community and beyond to formally reopen the Shabazz Center housed at the Audubon Ballroom, we must continue to clarify and strengthen our political identity rooted in the work of Dr. Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X, who both offered so much to so many. In particular, it is the wisdom and clarity sewn into the fabric of the Organization of Afro-American Unity that animates our ideology. In January of 1965, less than 2 months before his assassination, Malcolm delivered a speech to the Militant Labor Forum entitled Prospects of Freedom. In this speech, he explores his expanding transnational politics, and he also critiques the 1964 second-term election of Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson, who received sweeping support from Black Americans determined to keep Republican challenger Barry Goldwater out of office and away from the gaining tractions of the civil rights movement. In this speech, Malcolm condemns President Johnson for his silence and seeming ambivalence toward white supremacist representatives visiting Washington from Mississippi. Malcolm warns against a blind following of Johnson and his so-called progressive politics and reminds his audience that power, structural change, and social movement work often happens beyond the limits of government, and rather in places like the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and I'd like to believe he'd say the Shabazz Center and the People's Forum. The parallels one can draw between the hopefulness of a Johnson presidency and our forthcoming Biden presidency are numerous, and Malcolm's vision of power beyond the limits and structure of American bureaucracy remains true. Through our dynamic panel, I hope we can all wrestle with this moment and the uncertainty it holds, and also feel fortified by the truth that we are in a collective global struggle for equity, peace, and justice, and that our ancestors and elders have offered up endless wisdom and clarity on what it means to engage in the work of true human rights. I hope you enjoy this discussion, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Now I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. Dr. Burden-Stelly is an author, scholar, and educator. She is currently a visiting scholar in the Race and Capitalism Project at the University of Chicago. She also serves as an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Carleton College. Along with Dr. Gerald Horne, Burden-Stelly co-authored the book W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. She completed her PhD in African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley in 2016. She holds an MA in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in Political Science and in African and African American Studies from Barrett Honor College at Arizona State University. Her scholarship traverses Africana Studies, critical theory, political theory, and political economy with a substantive focus on anti-radicalism, anti-Blackness, and state-sanctioned violence, globalization and economic development, and epistemologies of Black studies. Welcome, Dr. Burden-Stelly.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. And I'm so sorry for that long bio. I should have just sent the 2 sentences, so my apologies. So tonight I'm going to be thinking actually with Ajamu Baraka, who is one of the founders of the Black Alliance for Peace, and which is actually also having a forum tonight about people-centered human rights. And so I want to think with his conceptual framework of people-centered human rights, and a couple of articles that he wrote, one of which was published in Black Agenda Report titled Malcolm X and Human Rights in the Time of Trumpism, Transcending the Master's Tools, and then another that is titled The Human Rights Project, Determined by the Needs of the Powerful. And so in the first article, Baraka writes that Malcolm X operated in the tradition of earlier Black radical activists and intellectuals who in the late 1940s understood the subversive potential of the concept of human rights when it was directed or sort of abstracted from the liberal, legalistic, and state-centered specifications that sort of dominate our understanding of human rights. For Malcolm, internationalizing resistance to the system of racial oppression in the US meant redefining the struggle for constitutional civil rights by transforming the struggle for full recognition of African American citizenship into a struggle for human rights. And so Baraka talks about how Malcolm X studied 3 petitions, one coming from the National Negro Congress, one from the NAACP, and one from the Civil Rights Congress that were filed with the United Nations. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about what those documents were and what happened to them. So the first petition was called a petition to the United Nations on behalf of 13 million oppressed Negro citizens of the United States. And this was filed with the United Nations in 1946. And essentially it meant to highlight the anti-Black exploitation, oppression, and exclusion, which continued to plague the lives of African Americans in the form of discrimination and industrial and business employment, and the semi-feudal serfdom that was manifested in sharecropping and tenancy in the Deep South, and subpar or non-existent education for Black children, and the enforcement of living in overcrowded slums and ghettos, and then the lynching and other modes of racial violence and terrorism against Black people. They also talked about the disenfranchisement and the degrading and dehumanizing segregation to which Black people were subjected. And so they specifically called on the United Nations, particularly the UN Economic and Social Council, to endorse the petition and mobilize its influence to redress the discrimination against African Americans who have petitioned the government time and again for redress of grievance with no result. And so in other words, they were saying that the US government was unresponsive to the plight of Black people in the US. And so the United Nations needed to supersede the US government and act on behalf of Black people. In 1947, the NAACP, under the leadership of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, filed an appeal to the world, a statement of the denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal of the United Nations for redress. So that's a long title, mouthful. So essentially, this petition showed that the Negro problem, or the condition of Blacks in the United States, was foundationally not only economic, but it was also an international problem, one whose resolution required the intervention of the United Nations. The United Nations needed to step in and use the very edge of their authority to protect the minority citizens in the United States, because this was not only in the interest of African Americans, but was in the interest of world peace and also foreigners who, if they had dark skin, were also at risk of being discriminated against, insulted, assaulted, and killed if they came to the United States. This position presented a mountain of evidence that conveyed the failure of the US government to uphold the civil liberties, civil rights, and human rights of US Blacks. It also addressed the failure of the federal government to protect the rights and citizenship of African Americans, primarily by kowtowing to the doctrine of states' rights. So the federal government refused to act on behalf of African Americans, saying that they didn't have the power or jurisdiction because of states' rights. And as we know, states' rights is being employed at this very moment to deny any sort of comprehensive federal plan to protect US citizens against the coronavirus that is specifically having a detrimental impact on racialized people. So again, this particular petition was showing that in order for African Americans to have their human rights respected, the UN was going to have to intervene, and that this was not only an issue for African Americans, but for the world at large, given the US hegemony and increasing US imperialism. So the third petition is called We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. And this is the most radical of the three documents, because this was filed with the Genocide Commission, and was not only a call for redress, or was not primarily a call for redress, but was actually a call to indict the US government and to hold the US government responsible for its violence against Black people. It was a 240-page document prepared by the left-wing Civil Rights Congress under the leadership of its National Executive Secretary, William L. Patterson. And it compiled even more evidence than an appeal to the world that documented more than 150 cases of murder or state-sanctioned executions and more than 350 instances of beating, maiming, rape, or threats just between the year of 1945 and 1951. And even this was just a fraction of all of the violence against Black people that had occurred. And this was a collective document that was prepared by a multitude of people and signed by a number of doyens of the Black left, including W.B. Du Bois, Charlotta Bass, Louis Burnham, Benjamin J. Davis, the Huntons, W.L. Fias and Dorothy, Claudia Jones, Louis Thompson Patterson, and the Robesons. So it was squad. They all signed it. And then even some sort of liberals like Mary Church Terrell. And so Patterson, in his autobiography, The Man Who Cried Genocide, Patterson says essentially they prepared this document not only because the US government was unresponsive and was responsible for this crime of genocide, but also because they wanted to raise the consciousness of people within the United States that the struggle of African Americans was indeed an international struggle. He also thought that he wanted to raise to the world that what was happening to African Americans was just a step toward what was going to happen to the rest of the world. And then, of course, 1951 is when the US entered into the Korean War. And so throughout the petition, there's all of these connections made between the economic and political domination of Black people and then the war that's being waged in Korea. And the ways that all of this is predicated on this racialized super exploitation. And the sort of radical nature of these petitions and the ways in which the US was really adamant about not having the African American issue become an international issue of human rights is manifested in the response to these petitions. So the National Negro Congress petition was basically swept under the rug by the US delegation at the United Nations. And it was prevented from coming under serious discussion. And that actually led to Du Bois preparing an appeal to the world to revive the issue. And Eleanor Roosevelt, everybody's hero, did not want, she worked very hard to not have an appeal to the world heard in the United Nations. And she even threatened to resign from the NAACP board because she had been embarrassed in her capacity as a member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council by the information that was in the petition. So in other words, she was embarrassed that the US was put on blast in the United Nations. And so again, the US delegation made sure that the appeal wasn't given serious consideration. With regard to recharged genocide, in 1952, 56 United States senators galvanized, they organized to, they proposed something called the Bricker Amendment, which will prevent the US Constitution from being overridden by international treaties and executive agreements. So in other words, Congress passed a sort of act so that the United Nations could not override any of the US policies towards Black people. And this was in direct response to the petition. Not only that, William Patterson's passport was canceled because he circulated the petition. And of course, Paul Robeson's passport had already been, Paul Robeson was involved in the preparation and circulation of We Charge Genocide. His passport had already been suspended because of his work that he was doing around human rights and workers' rights. So through the Organization of African American Unity, Malcolm X both built upon and exceeded these efforts of the NNC, the NAACP, and the CRC. He sought to demand international sanctions from the United Nations against the US for refusing to recognize that the human rights of the oppressed nation of African Americans. But he also understood that oppressed people themselves needed to organize against what was happening, and that basically petitioning the United Nations was one step in cultivating a radical political struggle among the oppressed and the racialized of the world. And so at the second Organization of African American Unity rally on July 5th, 1964, Malcolm X made the following statement about human rights, quote, "We have to make the world see that the problem that we're confronted with is a problem for humanity. It's not a Negro problem, it's not an American problem. You and I have to make it a world problem, make the world aware that there will be no peace on this earth as long as our human rights are being violated in America. Then the world will have to step in and try to see that our human rights are respected and recognized. We have to create a situation that will explode this world sky high unless we are heard from when we ask for some kind of recognition and respect as human beings. This is all we want, to be human beings. If we can't be recognized and respected as a human being, we have to create a situation where no human being will enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you're not for that, you're not for freedom. It means you don't even want to be a human being. You don't want to pay the price that is necessary," end quote. So here we see that Malcolm X is essentially throwing down the gauntlet that human rights is literally a matter of life and death. It is a matter of peace and further destruction. And as Fred Hampton says, it's peace only if you're willing to fight for it, right? And so I'm reaching the end of my time, but I just want to speak a little bit about the people-centered human rights framework that Ajamu Baraka has been cultivating, thinking with people like Malcolm X and William Patterson and W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and Claudia Jones and many, many others who understood the intimate connection between racialized violence, U.S. imperialism and Euro-American imperialism, war, and the inability of human flourishing to exist under these conditions. And so he writes that people-centered human rights are those non-oppressive rights that reflect the highest commitment to universal human dignity and social justice that individuals and collectives define and secure for themselves through social struggle. So in other words, human rights are not defined from the top down, they're defined from the bottom up. He says that they emanate from the Black radical tradition. They see human rights as an arena of struggle. So this struggle is ongoing. They're informed by the needs of the oppressed. They're part of a strategy for decolonization and radical social change. They specifically name the enemies of freedom, which is the Western white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy. And they include, so human rights is not this sort of lofty abstract thing. Human rights is safe and accessible food, clean water, free quality education, healthcare and healthiness for all, adequate housing, public transportation, wages and a socially productive job that allows for a dignified life, ending mass incarceration, universal childcare, opposition to war, right? And an eradication of the destruction of the environment, police abolition, right? And self-determination and things that are going to lead to the respect for democracy in all aspects of life. And so this is what human rights is. And we get the best understanding of human rights when we look at those who are the most oppressed, who are the most downtrodden. And for those of us who work from Marxist framework, who create the most value, who create the actual value in this world, and therefore who should have control over the material conditions of their lives, and therefore should live a life of human flourishing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burden-Stelly. Next up, we have our second panelist, Claudia de la Cruz, who's an educator, community organizer, and theologian. She is co-executive director of the People's Forum in New York City, a cultural and political education space that serves to convene, support, and exchange with US and international social movements committed to advancing the struggles of the poor and dispossessed. She holds a dual master's degree from Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University in theology and social work. Claudia is an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ. Good to see you. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Next time I'll stick to the 2-line bio as well. It's great to be amongst comrades. It's good to be able to be in conversation. As we all know, the world is living unprecedented times, and the crisis of capitalism accelerates and deepens the conditions of the working class in a very negative way. And so it is extremely relevant for us to be in conversation with our radical revolutionary legacy. Taking on the question of human rights in relationship to Malcolm X's work is crucial in this historical context. And so thank you so much, Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, for sharing with us and redefining what human rights is about. It calls us to push away from that abstract liberal definition of what human rights is. And I also think it's essential for us to understand that the question of Black liberation continues to be one that is intrinsically connected to the question of the economic base of society, which is capitalism. White supremacy has been a tool of the ruling class since the inception of the capitalist system, and it's meant to exploit, to oppress Black and brown bodies, and also to divide the working class, not only in the United States, but globally. And so it also begs for us to understand the importance that there is in the Black liberation struggle and its revolutionary potential, which continues to be intentionally interrupted by the ruling class for the sake of saving the capitalist system. Under the guise of diversity and representation these days, we have been given Black and brown leadership who do not represent our interests, but rather the interest of the ruling class. And we are expected to follow the misleadership of these folks. And it is almost impossible. I mean, I was asked to give a little bit of a current context analysis. And so it's almost impossible for us not to start an analysis of the current conjuncture without talking about COVID. I mean, you know, it's important to speak about the ways in which COVID has uncovered worldwide the brutal inequality and the inability of the capitalist states to solve the most pressing issues of the majority of the world's population, who are mostly poor and working class. And if we were to go into subcategories, mostly women, mostly Black and brown, with diversity of sexual orientations. I mean, the historically marginalized are experiencing this moment of crisis, which is a moment of converging crises in a way that is unprecedented, in a way that is very profound. This crisis has widened the wealth gap. The total wealth of US billionaires grew by $931 billion during the first 6 months of the pandemic, which means that it has grown even more in the last couple of months. The number of billionaires from the US has increased from 614 to 644, and during this same period, the US has seen 62 million people who have lost their jobs, 9 million people have fallen ill with the virus, and more than 250,000 people who have died from COVID. And there is no indication that these numbers will stop growing anytime soon. The massive impoverishment and deaths in this intensified crisis are disproportionately among poor Black and brown communities. Again, communities that have been intentionally neglected, oppressed, and exploited for capitalist profit, from colonialism to slavery until now. Every political choice taken by the ruling class and in favor of capitalism has positioned the working class, particularly those historically marginalized, in a disastrous position to face and overcome any crisis at any level. We have and will continue to see the growing demands from the working class around access to health, housing, employment. As we face the massive loss of jobs, millions of people join the ranks of the homeless population. We're talking about 40 million families who will lose their housing in the upcoming months, in addition to the hundreds of thousands who are already experiencing homelessness. Our communities were experiencing food insecurity, food insufficiency for decades before COVID. Now we have hunger that is increasing, and food programs and mutual aid programs that are overwhelmed and close to exhaustion to their resources. So any relief will not begin to scratch the surface of the profound economic hardships our communities are currently experiencing. Historically, when we hear the ruling class, the political parties talking about economic relief, we know what they mean. We know they mean massive multi-trillion-dollar bailouts for banks and corporations and leaving the poorest of the poorest to die. And the Biden administration does not promise anything different. His administration plans to recycle projects and people from previous administrations who have proven not to have the people's interests at heart. So the working class people will continue our struggle to survive within one of the biggest crises humanity has experienced, and without any real support from its government, without any real solution from a capitalist state. This will surely mean more social unrest, more protest, and the increase of state violence in all its forms. The ruling class will intensify its use of all its instruments, from the corporate media to its militarized police, to pacify, manufacture consent, and control the masses' discontent. We have seen the anti-socialist rhetoric, the good versus bad protester narrative. We are seeing the persecution and the entrapment of organizers who were part of the anti-racist protests, in addition to the creation and use of the law to criminalize the dissent and incarcerate folks under federal charges. This context presents us, communities in struggle and social movements, with enormous challenges, but also with many opportunities. And we can't afford to overlook either of those. We need to maintain the position that Biden's victory is not the victory of most of the people in this country or in any sister nation. And therefore, it is not in our interest to be relegated once again to being political spectators because Trump is no longer in the presidency. Trump may be gone, but capitalism, white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy continue to be the leading forces of this country. The deepening economic crisis will bring massive discontent once again, and we must find ways to organize that discontent. More and more workers are losing control over their working conditions. Workers who are forced to use their own tools to profit their employers. Think about the Uber economy. Think about the gig economy in many ways. Workers are working without any benefits, any protection, working tirelessly. You know, I think we have romanticized in some ways the quarantine. There's very few people who have been able to stay at home. There's the majority of people who are out there risking their lives day to day because they need to eat and they need to feed their families. And so millions of people are joining the ranks also of the unemployed and the homeless population. And what does this mean to the left and the social movements? Where do we need to put our emphasis and focus our work in? What would a mass working class political independent movement look like in this time? I think that those are questions for us to explore in relationship to the question of liberation and the question of human rights. This also means that there's a need to strengthen our political and community organizations and dedicate time to our leaders' political formation. If we do not do these things, we should be prepared for our class to be continuously misled to act in the interest of the ruling class. We need to deepen what our class consciousness is, you know, in addition to thinking about the many identities we've been told we need to think about. The class interest, our class interest is what should orient our work, because every system of oppression is connected to the ruling class interest. We are being challenged to activate the political consciousness of our people. And doing this work will require more from us at the grassroots. It will require strengthening mass political education efforts while we are also building support in our communities through survival projects. It is time to overcome the historical divisions that the ruling class has imposed on the working class and build principled unity for the advancement of the struggles of our people, of the poor and dispossessed. A unity centered on a program that brings together our demands for a dignified life and to achieve political power. Because ultimately, we could scream and shout human rights all we want, but if we do not gain economic and political power, then we're always at the will of those who have it, which is the ruling class at this moment. This unity must not be limited to the United States. It must be an international unity of the working class. And as we know, capitalism in crisis means that the imperialist offensive will increase and that the priorities of the capitalists will be towards attacking workers at home and abroad. The attacks against China, the attacks on Venezuela, the attacks on Cuba, on Iran, and other sister nations who have rejected the imperialist logic and are fighting for sovereignty will increase. The attacks and the interference in other countries to impose US dominance will increase. And we must have the consciousness that there are working class families that have more in common with us than the US state. And that these families are and will suffer due to US imposed sanctions, militarization, and extraction. So connecting these struggles to those in our communities in the US is key to our collective liberation. Given the domestic and global state of capitalism and the worsening conditions of the working class, building this type of unity amongst the oppressed and exploited of the world is more relevant and possible today than ever before. To conclude, the struggle for human rights, for the Black community, for all historically marginalized communities, the struggle to save Mother Earth is contingent on the destruction of the capitalist system and the creation and advancement of a socioeconomic and political project that places people over profits. Malcolm said in 1964, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, I don't have the quote, but he did say that our fight is not solely one to gain full citizenship rights. Our struggle continues to be one for human rights. And I think Dr. Burden-Stelly referred to that quote earlier. Our struggle, again, is one for human rights, and our work and our fight, our struggle should reflect that. As communities, we will, without a doubt, continue to fight to access the civil rights we have a right to and have been denied to us. And we will do this to advance our fight in the deconstruction of the very system that negates our humanity. That is the overall goal. The overall goal is to deconstruct the very system that negates our humanity, and that is capitalism. This means that Trump or Biden, we keep moving. We keep fighting because we know the resolution is not the change of tenant, of representative of the White House's ruling class. We know that the answer is to uproot the system that is violent, that creates deplorable conditions for the majority of people in the world. And so I just want to say that our struggle against capitalism, our struggle against white supremacy, our struggle against imperialism and patriarchy, and any other system that is utilized as an instrument of the ruling class is a struggle for human rights. And we should understand that, and we should hold that with dignity and push it forward, because there is the hope and there is the reality that history has taught us that we can defeat the beast. It's been proven. Cuba, Venezuela, China, we could do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your remarks. Lastly, we have Sean Blackmon. Sean is an activist, organizer, and radio host living in Washington, D.C. Originally hailing from Pensacola, Florida, Sean is active in anti-imperialist and international solidarity movements and is a co-founder of Stop Police Terror Project DC, a group that organizes against police misconduct and mass incarceration in the nation's capital. Sean studied journalism at his beloved Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and is currently co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, a daily radio show that focuses on global social movements, international news, and arts and culture. Welcome, Sean.
Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone's doing all right this evening. I want to begin by thanking the People's Forum and the Shabazz Center for having me this evening, although I must confess I'm feeling less thankful about having to go after those strong talks of Dr. Burden-Stelly and Claudia. Although, you know, I appreciate Claudia's talk because I think it dovetails nicely with some of the things I want to touch on this evening. I was asked to sort of talk about this issue of human rights from the perspective of the current moment with the incoming Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration. And this is an important question, because when considering this question about the current political moment that we're in here in the United States, the belly of the beast, the beating heart of world imperialism, and what this issue of human rights potentially means with the incoming administration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you know, these two proud guardians of the neoliberal order, I'd like to frame my comments here within the movement politics of Malcolm X. And I think it's important that we talk about this because there continues to be a rebellion against racism that rages in the streets. And we're seeing exploited labor that's now been dubbed essential workers. You know, they're striking, organizing, and fighting back against the abuse of the bosses and the CEOs. We hear ringing cries of defund the police, cancel the rent. People are demanding that this government stop propping up Wall Street, chanting that the banks got bailed out and we got sold out. So we're in a movement moment. And of course, Malcolm X was a movement person. I mean, we're talking about someone who was literally born into the Black radical tradition, with his parents being a part of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, you know, the largest organization of working class Black folks in history. And we should always remember that when Malcolm was assassinated, he was in the midst of building not one, but two organizations himself, one political and the other religious. Of course, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Malcolm was someone who understood at a cellular level that Black liberation could only be achieved through organized struggle. So when we consider the prospects for human rights under a Biden-Harris administration, I think really we should begin by taking a hard look at just who they are and who it is they're bringing into the White House. We know that Joe Biden was Obama's right-hand man during the campaigns of mass deportation, drone warfare, bailing out the banks, plunging Libya into a failed state, among other crimes. We know him as one of the architects of the mass incarceration state, who told a room full of rich donors that nothing will fundamentally change should he ascend to the White House, and that, quote, no one's standard of living will change. And what was he doing? He was reassuring these people that he will be a responsible steward of the affairs of the ruling class. Unlike Donald Trump, who proved to be erratic, belligerent, and unpredictable, and ultimately unconcerned with the interests of the Republican Party and his fellow elites. And when it comes to Kamala Harris, this is someone who bragged about being the top cop of California and literally laughed when she talked about throwing parents in jail because of her truancy policies. One of her favorite pastimes in office was locking up Black people and keeping them there. We also know how devoted she is to supporting the racist apartheid state of Israel. She even once attended an off-the-record meeting of AIPAC to push back against any creeping pro-Palestinian sentiment that may have been getting into the Democratic Party. But we're supposed to be inspired by her because, you know, she's a member of AKA and attended Howard University. So, you know, I guess when she's riding shotgun as Saudi Arabia carries out another war crime in Yemen, or Biden ratchets up sanctions in Venezuela, we can feel good about the fact that she used to stroll on the yard back in the day. But be that as it may, so even just looking at Biden and Harris as individuals, we have two people who have affirmed their loyalty to white supremacy and capitalism. In the case of Biden, someone who bragged about beating the socialist and Bernie Sanders during the presidential election, and who not only won't defund the police, but wants to give cops even more money, and who are actually to the right of Donald Trump on international issues like China and the DPRK, and who are just fine supporting the ongoing genocidal campaign against the Palestinians, just to name a few issues. So already the human rights picture there looks grim, but believe it or not, it actually gets worse. I mean, just today, it was reported that Biden is naming none other than Susan Rice as the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, giving her authority over issues like immigration, healthcare, and racial concerns. And her record is well established in abetting genocide in the Congo, shielding U.S. client states in Africa from facing justice in their role in those massacres, underdeveloping and destabilizing countries like Somalia so Washington can have access to its lakes of oil. I mean, just a real blood-soaked history in Africa, which is important when we talk about Malcolm X and his Pan-Africanism and how he always made a point to connect the destiny of Black Americans to the destiny of the African continent. And now that Rice will be taking on a domestic role, we may very well be staring down the barrel at serious austerity measures that will further deteriorate conditions for the masses of poor, working, and oppressed people in this country. Not to mention, it was reported earlier this week that Biden wants to name General Lloyd Austin as head of the Pentagon. Austin is a former head of the Central Command and is a sitting member on the board of directors at Raytheon. If confirmed, it will mark the first time in history that a Black man serves as the finger on the trigger of the US war machine. And the funny thing about that, there are people who feel that Michelle Flournoy, a white woman, should actually have that position. And who is Flournoy? I mean, this is a known war hawk who was directly involved and US intervention in Libya and Syria and escalating the 20-year war in Afghanistan. So it's clear that in this moment, where the whole of capitalism is facing a crisis of stability and credibility, where the state feels it necessary to contort and shift to protect itself, that the optics of the ruling class have changed, but their aims remain the same. So we're entering a period of a kind of woke neoliberalism and intersectional imperialism, where we'll be under the authority of a diverse cast of oppressors whose identity is meant to deflect from their role in maintaining the US's position as the world's superpower. And with all I've mentioned, along with the ongoing ravages of climate change, the coronavirus pandemic, economic devastation as millions find themselves unemployed and on the brink of hunger and homelessness and never-ending war, I mean, all these things, human rights both within and without the United States stand to take a serious blow under the incoming administration. And that's the bad news. But the good news is, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't just have to sit here and take it. If we view this struggle through the scope of Malcolm X's politic of anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, Pan-Africanism, and internationalism, we can organize the kind of movement with the politics and ideology necessary to pull humanity back from the brink, to defend human rights, and to affirm our essential dignity. And, I look forward into getting, deeper into what Malcolm X has to say to our movement throughout this conversation. And I was actually just thinking about how, when you look at the kind of foundational document of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, one of the first things they say is that we are convinced of the inalienable rights of all people to control our destiny, their destiny rather. And this is what we must do. We must take destiny into our own hands and dare to struggle, because when we dare to struggle, we know that we dare to win.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean. Thank you. That's a really beautiful way to close out the initial remarks in this conversation. Now I want to open this up to some questions that we have, first from audience members, and I encourage everyone to continue submitting questions. And I also have a few prepared questions myself. And also, of course, I want to make sure that the remainder of our time can be fruitful. So if y'all have thoughts and remarks that you want to continue building off of, or questions for each other, I encourage you to engage in that. So the first question is from one of our audience members, and it's a little long, so maybe we'll need a reframing, but let me know what you all think. What do we know about the ability or power of the United States or any international group that received the appeals to actually be able to intervene or hold the United States accountable? Were they compromised in any way through the international influence of the United States, economic or otherwise? And then in parentheses, beyond any laws or restrictions passed internally by the United States Congress. And I believe that this is in reference to Malcolm imploring the Organization for African Unity to charge the United States for crimes against humanity.
Yeah, so all from the National Negro Congress petition to Malcolm X and the Organization of African American Unity, they realized that the UN is not an enforcement body. They don't have actual power to supersede like the sovereignty of particular nations. But again, the United States, that did not stop the United States from passing this act in Congress that meant to reaffirm that the United Nations could not supersede any sort of laws of the U.S. And so even as folks understood that the UN cannot necessarily enforce any policy, it's more than even a symbolic victory. It's sort of like a consciousness raising that the United States cannot engage in genocide, or it cannot sort of marginalize and oppress the racialized people, and in fact, the overwhelming majority of the country, with impunity. And not only this, that passing resolutions in the United Nations shows solidarity, right? It shows the ways in which other countries who are full of, racialized, marginalized, oppressed, and formerly colonized people are not going to stand for this form of domination and repression from the United States. And so it's more of a show of solidarity. And it's also not only filing, but circulating these petitions is also a form of consciousness raising, both in the United States and beyond, to just sheerly show to the world what's actually going on, but to also raise the consciousness of people to organize and to struggle on the ground against these forms of repression and domination that are happening, and also so that people throughout the world can link up the forms of the sort of resonant forms of oppression that are happening throughout, right? Because U.S. imperialism looks a particular way within the context of the United States, but then there's also like a massive U.S.-based apparatus throughout the world. For example, there is the United States as a state, but then there's also U.S.-led corporations that are implementing all of these forms of repression and domination in various ways throughout the world. And so even if the United States can't, or excuse me, even if the United Nations can't enforce any sort of policy change in the United States, even though those sort of sanctions and those that calling out actually really matters. It's the same as if the Organization of American States issued a sanction against the United States for the murders, the ongoing police murder, police occupation, and police brutality in this country. Because the United States actually has like monetary sanctions and actual blockades. But so for example, the U.S. just tried to illegitimize the Venezuelan elections, right? And like this matters, this discourse and this aggression matters. And so if that is turned on the United States so that it knows that it is not above impunity, I think that actually matters a lot.
I want to offer space to anyone else to respond to that question. And if not, I have a follow-up question. One of the things that I'm wondering, and Dr. Burden-Stelly touched on this international understanding of human rights. And I think that part of what the United States does so well, even to colonize citizens, is our inability to conceive of the world and the ways in which human rights affects our global community, and how do folks view us in the United States. And so to that end, I'm wondering if you all can help to better contextualize, whether it be in Venezuela or elsewhere, how colonized countries currently understand this US sociopolitical landscape, and in what ways can global movement work help continue to clarify what it means to engage in this human rights struggle from a non-US centric lens?
Well, I think this is an important piece to touch on. And the more time goes on, the more that I become even
Sean, I don't believe we can hear you right now, or at least I can't.
Great. Okay, cool. All right, dope. So yeah, and this is important because when we talk about the movement for Black lives, right, to be specific, I've noticed over the past couple of years a real interest in this issue of resisting imperialism, right? So folks in the movement are concerned about what the US is doing, trying to carry out regime change in Venezuela, concerned about Washington backing a brutal right-wing military coup in Bolivia, concerned about the Trump administration carrying out this, decision unilaterally to assassinate Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, all these sorts of things. And really from the beginning, and I really think that the seed of this kind of nascent anti-imperialism is the Palestinian struggle. I mean, from the time of Ferguson, this kind of reigniting of the Black Palestinian solidarity movement, I think is a big part of what kicked this off. And the funny thing about Americans, even those of us who consider ourselves radicals and revolutionaries, I think sometimes we still get caught up in this frankly, imperial kind of arrogance that the US has about itself. We assume that we're the most sophisticated and the best informed. And in reality, we are the most propagandized people in the world, right? And I say that without exaggeration because you can only be the world's superpower with this major capitalist state and over 800 foreign military bases and all those sorts of things if to some extent you kind of have a consent from the public. And when you know that if you were to tell the truth about why the US maneuvers the way it does, both inside and outside the country, well, not only would people like not support it, they would actively resist it. And so this is the importance of these corporate-owned media platforms that serve as bullhorns for imperialism. And the people that are called journalists are oftentimes just stenographers for the ruling class. And so it's so important that we sharpen our analysis to understand what's really happening. Why is it that the media propagates this lie about Venezuela threatening to starve people if they don't vote for the Maduro government forces in this election, which is literally something that we saw, or that China is sending a bunch of spies to the United States to steal intellectual property or whatever, or that Russia is disrupting our fair democracy, all these sorts of things. And this is the importance of not only movement building and not only conceiving yourself as a domestic movement, but making those links with the different social movements across the globe. And another thing that I'm saying that I think is great is the movement making connections with like the NSARS movement in Nigeria. So that helps us get into a thing of, well, what is AFRICOM doing on the continent? Why there's so many bases there? The military relationship between the US and Nigeria, and all these sorts of things. And the reason it's important is because the more we develop these ties, the clearer we can see is that the root of all of our issues are the same. And that becomes the basis, I think, through which we can build the movement out as an international one and strike at the global ruling class.
I mean, I agree with everything that Sean just mentioned, and I think the moment is right for us to be able to intensify working class internationalism and bring back a lot of the references that there are in our radical legacy and history. I mean, it goes back to the Lincoln delegation that was created to fight fascism. And a lot of working class Black folks went to fight fascism in Spain. I think the aspect that I consider something very important to working class internationalism is basically deconstructing that American exceptionalism that you were talking about earlier, Sean, like the sense of we're going to go teach you. I think that the Global South has a lot to teach us in so many ways. If we think about the projects that have been created or that were created during the 90s, being led by Chavez, and this coordination, this articulation of governments and social movements in the American continent that were concerned with real democracy, with real sovereignty, with anti-imperialist sentiment, right? They didn't all kind of align in many things, but they aligned with the sentiment that they had the right to self-determination, that they had the right for sovereignty. And I think that speaks to the smaller scale type of organizing and the international way of organizing. And we have to be able to get those lessons from those spaces that are still there. I mean, there's still en Alba Movimientos, the articulation of hundreds of organizations in the American continent that are doing work to advance democracy, sovereignty, and the projects that are away from the logic of the capitalist logic. There is the development of the International People's Assembly, which the People's Forum is a part of and supports, and it's international organizations and social movements coming together to speak about the need of advancing the class interest. And beyond speaking about it, how do we elaborate projects that reflect that regionally, locally, nationally, internationally, right? So I think in the United States, we have this culture where we position ourselves in solidarity. But a lot of the times, the work that we do at the base does not reflect that. And there needs to be a way of popularizing the working class internationalism that some organizations speak to and position themselves in solidarity, but how does that translate to the day-to-day work that we're doing and the consciousness that is being developed in our grassroots? And so I think that that's very important, and things that are challenging for us to think more about collectively.
Another question that we have, and some of this was sort of touched on in the remarks made earlier, but in what ways has your understanding of human rights evolved, specifically during Trump's time in office? And in what ways do you predict movement work and conversation around human rights to shift under a Biden and Harris presidency, if at all?
Well, I have never been one to use the framework of human rights because of the way that it is overdetermined by a sort of liberal individualist, or even sort of kind of legalistic, both approach as well as understanding, and also the ways in which human rights has been used as a bludgeon for the global South. Like if you look, for example, at the International Criminal Court, I believe it is only African leaders in Slobodan Milosevic, an Eastern European, so hearkening back to the anti-communism, anti-socialism that have been taken before the International Criminal Court. So when we talk about human rights and we talk about violations of human rights, it is used in a very sort of imperialistic and racist manner. Moreover, when we talk about humanitarianism, it is grossly unhumanitarian. It is in the form of aid that leads to food insecurity throughout the world. It is in the form of military aid that is meant to turn the state against its population to defend corporate and imperial interests. It is in the service of hypocritically pointing to either gender or sexuality issues in other nations to rationalize invasion. And I think that is the dominant way in which human rights has been deployed and employed. And so even as we're thinking about, if we think with the Jambu Baraka and others who have been developing this people-centered human rights framework, if it is that if we can reposition that as the means of thinking about human rights, I think it's a useful terminology. But we can just talk about straight up liberation. We could just talk about straight up revolution. Like we don't need to put a fucking tuxedo on it. So I really as my comrades have spoken about very, very eloquently, a change, I love this term a change in the tenant of the White House is superfluous. It does not matter, right? And so there's no change in terms of how we think about human flourishing from a Bush 1 to a Clinton to an Obama to Bush 2, I guess Bush 2, then Obama, then Trump, then Biden. It's one long continuation of corporatocracy, of oligopoly, and of warmongering capitalist imposition. And so I think it would behoove us to think about regime change here simply as how much can we stop the bleeding or hold the line, but that has no bearing on the type of work that we need to do on the ground, because our structural and material conditions continue to be deplorable. The US continues to be a war machine and that has no problem, for example, passing a defense budget in the hundreds of billions, but can't even come to a consensus over 600 raggedy ass dollars for ordinary people, which is going to do nothing. And so I really think that we need to stop looking at the top and start looking around at each other and really think about and not be reactive and just really, again, as my comrades have been saying, continue movement building, continue organizing. And for petty bourgeois Negroes such as myself, like what, not be part of the fucking problem and not try to engage in this intersectional imperialism and this woke neoliberalism and do our job, which is to redistribute resources and wealth. So.
Yeah, when you were talking about the issue of aid, Dr. Burden-Stelly, I was thinking about, Thomas Sankara when he raised a similar thing. And he was basically like, don't give us rice and all these things that just create dependency. You know what I mean? Give us the tools and the training and all those sorts of things so that we can, basically be self-sufficient. And I appreciate you in the chat raising the issue of the Caribbean, of Guyana and Haiti, and how, imperialism and neocolonialism is still very much alive there. I mean, Mike Pompeo took a whole tour through the Caribbean. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was the first U.S. Secretary of State to actually visit Guyana. And it wasn't for the scenery, right? It was because, the U.S. government wanted to interfere or, stick their nose into that election and see what was cracking with that oil as ever. You know what I mean? In a number of ways. And so it's interesting, to think about, like my own conception of human rights, because I was never really inclined to think in those terms, but it was never conscious really. But the class character of that, as ever, is so important. And the first thing I thought of is, Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, who, literally was calling the elections in Venezuela fraudulent before they had even happened. And this thing of humanitarian intervention and the right to protect. I mean, just this imperial paternalism that is wrapped up in the liberal reactionary character of how we popularly think of human rights. And I tend to agree that if you think about like Black liberation, right? Like Black liberation is human rights. And particularly as the United States continues to advertise itself as the paragon of upright nationhood, that it exemplifies all things good and democratic. As Black folks, we are proof of that lie, right? We are the chief contradiction of this country. And so liberation for us will necessitate the decimation of the whole system. It'll upset the whole setup, if you will. And with the issue of, this kind of changing on the guard from Republican to Democrat administration, even then, it's the reason why the liberal outrage around Donald Trump, right? I would say it's chiefly around his uniquely repugnant way of presenting himself, right? So he had no concern whatsoever for the niceties and, little rituals and whatnot of quote unquote, civility within mainstream politics. He was racist out loud. He was misogynist out loud. He said his, anti-immigrant xenophobia out loud. Well, you're not supposed to do it quite like that. You're supposed to, use a little nicer language and pretend like you're not doing that. But that was a part of his appeal. He was such a clear break from the norm, right? From politics as usual, as embodied by a Hillary Clinton, as embodied by a Joe Biden and people like this, right? And so the ruling class's issue with him is not that he holds those reactionary tendencies. It's that the instability that he creates makes it difficult for them to operate. And even what he's been doing lately with refusing to concede and thereby transgressing that hallowed ritual of the peaceful transition from one party to another. But Trump don't care nothing about that. He's trying to save his own hide, right? He knows that when he no longer has that executive immunity, that's all she wrote. And he'll be open to a lot, him and his family. And so he has this kind of destabilizing effect on things. But we should be clear that he still is a part of the ruling class, and Democrats and Republicans are two ruling class parties who are headed in the same direction, who are headed towards that same goal of crushing and robbing the masses of poor, working, depressed folks of their humanity. They're in the same lane, they're just going different speeds.
So I know we're running low on time. I want to ask one more question. And also, I'd just like to say, I think that both remarks made around this conception of human rights is super important, because I think it does two things. One, I think that it, posits human rights as an increasingly obsolete idea. And at the same time, it also reclaims and recenters a particular political ideology and Black power lineage around human rights that recenters our thinking in what it means and what it looks like for a global stage. So I'm really grateful for the contextualization of human rights, and also why it's a term lots of us are actually not inclined to use in the first place to describe the sorts of conditions we're talking about. And lastly, I'd like to ask, as a millennial and young person, why, how do we feel hopeful in this moment? And we feel this impending existential and very physical material doom, and it's just overwhelming. And so why should folks be learning, be engaging, be reading in this moment if we don't have a whole lot to look forward to? What a lovely way to end such a brilliant conversation.
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, because I think hopelessness is one of the tools of the ruling class. Like, they manufacture hopelessness. They manufacture a sense of discouragement. The levels of people who are suffering from depression and mental health issues are not isolated from the system of capitalism. Like, we need to be able to understand that, right? The fact that people aren't able to pay bills, that people aren't able to feed their families, that they have to leave their jobs to take care of their babies. And sometimes it's more than one in a household, and they're doing virtual, like, all these stressors are part of what the capitalist system does. And it maintains us in a process of always having to do in reaction to the system, right? This concept of being able to build in response and strategically is robbed away from us because we're caught up in the day-to-day. You feel me? And so the question that you're asking is a very key question for folks that are looking to do effective organizing. And I honestly think that is a question for the movement at large, right? How do we spark hope in these moments of extreme chaos and crisis? And I think we need to be more creative than we have ever been. And as movements, I think a lot of the times we tend to go for the rhetoric, for the discourse, for the correct words, the correct language. And I think it's also detrimental to us to only stick to that. I mean, we need the analysis, we need the political education, we need the massive reach to our people. And yet at the same time, we need to be aware that a lot of the win of the capitalist system is that they tap into the subjectivity of the people. They tap into what moves people, right? And so I think we need to dedicate time to understand our communities, to understand the politics of our community, to understand how our communities are organized, because they have a level of organization, and not come in with a sense of we're going to save you, because somehow these communities are saving themselves because they ain't no fucking politician coming in to save them. We know that, right? And so it's I think for me, it's understanding the politics and the organization of communities, is not being afraid of our people, actually getting to know our people and getting to know what moves them. If you're listening to Cardi B, we got to know why they're listening to Cardi B, instead of like just straight up telling them that they're wrong. Why are they doing it, right? It moves an aspiration that the ruling class has already instilled in people, that the only way to get out is to be able to get rich, right? Not to destroy the system, but to get rich. And so we need to tap into those aspirations. There's a lot of work that we need to do. We should, I think, be uplifting models that are socioeconomic and political models that are working, that have been working for working class people. You know, a lot of folks talk about China, and there obviously it's contradictions, but the fact that they were able to build a hospital in 10 days to address the issue of COVID, like, what is going on with the United States? Haven't we stolen enough to do something similar? Like, there's been enough theft around the world and extraction by imperialist forces that the lack of resources shouldn't necessarily be a justification for the negligence of the government. And so, again, I think uplifting models that are existing and that are working for the working class, I think positioning ourselves with our people is another way. And there's hope that, I mean, history teaches us that, and I try to end it that way. Like, history teaches us that we can win, but the factor is what Sean was talking about. How organized are we to take that victory? Are our efforts being funneled to advance the interests of the ruling class? And I think they are. They have been. And so the level of class consciousness that we're able to acquire can ultimately be what leads us to a victory of the people. And that depends on many people, not one organization, not one person, not one leader, many organizations thinking and working politically for that aim.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have very much to add. I just, you know, Fidel Castro said, like, revolutionaries are always optimistic. And I just really believe that. And also, like, chaos, so a lot of I'm like ovaries deep in the 1930s right now, because I feel like there's so much that was happening in the 1930s. And I'm also like writing this book, but like there's so much that was happening in the 1930s that resonates with now, like the rise of fascism and the ways in which popular fronts coalesced, right? The anti-colonial and anti-fascist fronts coalesced in that moment. As Claudia mentioned, like the people that went and fought in Spain, the people that were struggling on behalf of the invasion of Abyssinia by the Italians, and of the worker strikes, all of the energy that was around defeating fascism and, and identifying in imperialism and colonialism as basically the close cousins, as George Padmore and C.L.R. James said, of fascism. And so I think that, to me, I'm more concerned about the people who are not miserable and who are well adjusted to this deeply inhuman, deeply destructive society in which we live. And so, to me, so I'm an academic, and the academy is odious. It is the intellectual arm of the state writ large. And I'm always uncomfortable. I am always mad as hell. And I tell myself, the minute that I feel well adjusted in this shit, like, come get me. It's a clone, send help, right? Because like I want to feel like an outsider in that space, because I want to be in it, but not of it. And so all of that to say, I think that it's a productive discomfort and a sort of a productive ill ease that we have, because that means that we know like there's something better to come, right? If we will struggle for it, if we'll organize for it. I do think we have never faced anything like this ever, because of the whether you call it superstructure, whatever, but we have so much social media. We're in the golden age of television, meaning that there's so much distraction. There's so much that allows us to continue to negotiate the terms of our immiseration, and to think that we're doing far better than we actually are. And to think that, to identify with the ruling class, because it's like, if we just work hard enough, or if we just hit it big, or, get our angles right on Instagram, that we too can join the elite, right? And it's complete bullshit, right? Because the reason why the rich are very rich is because most of us don't have anything. And so I think that it's important for us to continue to raise consciousness and to fight the anti-communism and anti-radicalism. So my work is thinking about the linkages between anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism, precisely because the anti-radicalism colonizes the imagination, right? It colonizes, or it crushes freedom dreams, so that our our horizon of possibility is like Keynesianism, right? It's fucking embedded liberalism. It's social, you know, this social democratic shit, right? That is really just a band-aid on a gaping wound, as everybody's using using that analogy. So to make a short story long as I do, I think that the world collapsing, or the decline of US imperialism, the collapse of US imperialism, is something to be joyful about. It's painful and it's hard, but yay, shit. Like our time is well past our prime. And I think that that's not something to, that's something to organize around, but it's not something to lament about, because we deserve better.
Yeah, just yesterday on By Any Means Necessary, we spoke with Miss Janine Africa of the Move family, who had a son who died in the bombing in 1985. And we were talking to her because, as some of you may know, the city of Philadelphia issued, this week apology about the bombing, and did it more so as a media stunt than to actually, give reparations for what happened. And so the point of the Move family was like, well, we don't want your apology. We want, a real change. We want you to free Mumia. And when I look at how the Move family has kept themselves in one piece as a unit, after the full brunt of this state crushed them. We spoke to Delbert Africa not long after he got out. And we know that he died not long after, and still had that spirit. How do you do that? How did Albert Woodfox spend 44 years in solitary confinement, came out and was still struggling? I think of Mutulu Shakur. I think of Sundiata Acoli. I think of Leonard Peltier, Kamal Siddiqui, Russell Maroon Schultz. I think of all of our political prisoners who've been behind the wall now for decades, but they never stopped. They never stopped contributing. They never let this racist, capitalist state crush them, because they knew that there was yet a struggle to be won, right? And I think about what they go through on a daily basis, and what they've been going through for decades at some point. And I look at that and I say, well, why wouldn't I be hopeful? When I think about how enslaved Africans in this country, when they were out in the field, and they would sing that song where they said, I feel like old Samson, and if I had my way, I would tear this building down. Not tear myself, but this building, and how that hatred of oppression is really a love for freedom. And how, they're in a place where they don't know if they'll ever see a free day or a day as a free person. But they didn't roll over and die. They kept living. They kept resisting. And so, with all the challenges that we're facing today, we would be doing a disservice to them and a disservice to this history and this tradition if we just gave up. We're going to give up because it's hard? Kwame Ture said that revolutionaries don't look for easy tasks. We look for hard tasks. And so overturning the wealthiest, most powerful, most brutal state this earth has seen, that ain't gonna be no easy task, y'all. It requires a lot from us. And we'll either rise to the occasion, or we'll have to live with the guilt that we let it destroy us. And I don't intend to do that. And that's why it's so important that we continue to build this movement with that same spirit and that same mentality and with that same thrust. so that not only do we not let it crush us, but that we in fact throw that force back to build the society completely anew in the image and likeness of those who built it. And I think that's where a lot of that hope can come from.
That was the whole word. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to end this conversation with a quote from the late and great James Hal Cone of Union Theological Seminary. He said that to be human is to be free, and to be free is to be human. The liberated, the free, are the ones who define the meaning of being in terms of the oppressed of the land by participating in their liberation, fighting against everything that opposes integral humanity. Only the oppressed are truly free. And I think that's a perfect way to close out this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. For this feels like this is spiritual work too. You know, we have to restore ourselves and pour love and affirmation that we're here and we're doing work. And it's the struggle. It's the despair where we see glimmers of hope and that what we're doing is working. And so I'm so grateful for you all. And I hope that folks watching us feel similarly. So thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to the People's Forum.
Wow, what a great way to end tonight's discussion. Thank you so much, Najha, for moderating tonight's event. Our panelists, Dr. Stelly, Claudia de la Cruz, Sean Blackmon. This is such a crucial discussion for the times we are in. And we also want to thank the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center for co-organizing this event tonight. And also for more information on the People's Forum and any upcoming events, please visit our website at peoplesforum.org. Good night, everyone.